Good morning and welcome. I'm really super glad to have everybody with us today on Election Science Office Hours, which is a webinar and podcast that's hosted by the Lynn Center for Science, Society, and Policy, also known as the LCSSP here at Caltech, and moderated by me, Michael Alvarez. Our Election Science Office Hours archive, pretty awesome. It's got over 30 episodes now. They're all listed on the Democracy and Elections section of the Lynn Center's website at lcssp.caltech.edu. They're all on our YouTube channel, and they're also available as podcasts on Spotify and Apple Podcast playlists. Also, please follow the Center, LCSSP, on LinkedIn, X, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook, in addition to following us on YouTube for all of the latest updates, not just in our democracy and elections work, but all the other things that we're doing at the LCSSP. And one last bit of housekeeping. If you have a question, for those of you who are participating live, please post it in the Q&A area on the Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer it as time allows. Okay, today, again, I'm super excited. Every week or every other week I say that, but I'm even more excited than usual because I'm joined by my guest, longtime colleague and friend, Natalie Adona, Registrar of Voters in Marin County, California. For those of you who do not know Natalie, and to be honest, I don't know who would not know Natalie, but if you don't know her, she's appearing actually for the second time on Election Science Office Hours, which gives you a sense for how much I love talking to Natalie. She last appeared in September 2024, and we're going to touch base on some of the things we talked about in that episode. So if you missed that episode, please go to the archive and check it out. Natalie, great to have you here again, and thanks for giving us an opportunity to catch up.
Thanks for the invite. It's good to be here. Hi, everyone.
So as I said, Natalie is the Registrar of Voters for Marin County, California. She's also the secretary for the California Association of Clerks and Election Officials and a member of the County Recorders Association of California. She holds a Certified Elections and Registration Administrator Credential, or CERA, from Auburn, which many of you know is a nationally recognized program tailored specifically for election administrators. Natalie has previously served as the Clerk-Recorder, Register of Voters in Nevada County, California, co-chaired the Ballot Design Advisory Committee established by the Secretary of State's office here in California. She previously served the city and county of San Francisco and the county of Alameda, California, where she conducted public attorney programs. Now, last but not least, and almost sort of most excitingly, she worked in the nonprofit sector with election administrators and also has worked with academics and political scientists, especially to help improve election and voting policy. So let's dive into it. Natalie, again, welcome back to Election Science Office Hours, and thanks for joining me here today.
Thank you for the kind intro. Appreciate it.
Now, not only have you been on Election Science Office Hours before, you've actually also spoken to Caltech students in my election science class, right?
Mhm.
In your previous role as the local election official in Nevada County, California, which is part of the old gold rush area in the western foothills of the Sierra Nevada. For those of you who don't know California geography, it's a little bit east of the California-Nevada state line. Now you're the Register of Voters in Marin County, which is directly across the Golden Gate Bridge to the north of San Francisco in the San Francisco Bay Area. So you're still in Northern California, but you've moved considerably west. So tell us about the change.
Yeah, sure. And just, one mild correction for you, not even
Uh,
really a correction. The area that I used to serve in is called the Mother Lode.
Mother lode. Okay, sorry. Okay, the
Yeah, I
mother
mean,
lode.
you can't skip over an awesome name like the Mother Lode, but yeah, that is basically the, sort of area where the big, sort of haul of gold had come
Where
out of
all
that
of the gold
area.
came from during the gold rush.
Yeah. So, yeah, it was wonderful serving that community. And I'm now in the Bay Area. And I mean, frankly, I wanted to come back to the Bay Area. This is where I grew up.
Mhm.
I grew up in neighboring Solano County, but as a kid would often come to Marin County because it's got so many outdoor activities and beautiful views, and it's sort of a gem in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I would say that the biggest difference is, I mean, there's a lot of differences between the counties. And, one of my favorite people, Neil Kelly, who used to be the registrar for Orange County, had once said to me, once you visited one elections office, you visited one elections office. And it's absolutely true. So there's more registered voters here in Marin. Nevada County has around 75,000 registered voters. Here in Marin, we have about 174,000 registered voters. We also use different equipment than Nevada. Over there, I had used the Hart Intercivic voting system, and here we're using Liberty Vote, the voting system formerly known as Dominion. And we have a different election management system, and so different processes here. So basically, I've had to relearn some stuff, and at the same time, a lot of it feels very familiar to me. We still have the same set of laws that we follow. We still need to communicate with the public about what's happening in elections and make sure that everyone gets the information that they need so they can make an informed choice and cast their ballot before the polls close.
Now, what about size? I mean, how did the county scale respectively, both in terms of the number of voters, but also the number of folks working in your office?
I mean that's interesting to me because I mean the scale really sort of plays out in the sort of in-person voting process for me. When I worked in Nevada, I had a team of 10, including me. Part of those folks were just clerk and recorder, and the other set of those folks just worked on elections. So here I've got a total of 12, including me,
Hmm.
and we all work on elections. So, the scale, I mean, in terms of the number of people I'm managing, not so much of an increase, but the focus on elections and how we run things is quite different to me. In a smaller county like Nevada, we all are what I call generalists.
Hmm.
We know all parts of the election system and sort of can jump into sort of anything pretty quickly. Whereas here we've got specialists who, they are experts in the area in which they work. There are people who specialize, for example, in maintaining voter registration or doing voter education and outreach or training poll workers. And, so, that has been a little bit of an adjustment for me. It requires a different level of communication as the department head. And, I think, one of the biggest things for me that I've had to adjust to that I think has been fairly easy. In Nevada, I was an elected,
Hmm.
and here in Marin, I am appointed.
So what does that difference mean practically for you? Being elected, you've got a different set of constituents, right? But how does that change the way you approach your job?
Not really, but because my guidepost is always serving the voters,
Hmm.
right? But the big difference is that when you're an elected, your boss is the voters.
Hmm.
When you're an appointed, your boss is the CEO, and the board of supervisors has I think more of a say in what we do. And honestly, I welcome that kind of collaboration also. I don't need the power of an elected office to sort of do what I do. And I feel like I need to be as responsive to voters here as I was there.
Hmm.
So for me, there's not much of a difference. Maybe if I were elected for a longer period of time, I would have a different answer. But I'm very happy to not have to campaign and run an election where I appear on the ballot.
Right. And one of the things we talked a lot about when you're working in Nevada, especially like in my class, and then also back in 2024, was that Nevada County was a California VCA county.
Mhm.
And you were one of the early movers, right, on kind of in the VCA implementation here. And you did a lot of really interesting and innovative things as part of that. Uh, is Marin a VCA type county?
It is. It went to the Voters' Choice Act in 2022, and yeah, I mean, it obviously predated my time here in Marin, but after talking with the staff and talking with my predecessor, it was quite an adjustment for this team to go from 1 day of voting to now a total of 11 days of in-person voting. And the challenges with making that move are, some of them are technical, some of them are administrative, but there's also, sort of the public facing aspect of it where, voters have
Mhm.
to learn where their voting location is if they choose to vote in person. Some of them have been surprised that the place that they used to vote doesn't have voting anymore. And so there's a sort of ongoing process of education to let folks know, guess what? You can choose any place within the county to cast a ballot, and you don't have to vote provisionally because we've got you on the list somewhere. And even if we don't have you on the list, you can do same day registration.
Mhm.
So it's a win-win, I think, for everyone.
Great. And so more generally, you've had a huge amount of experience in California. For someone so young, it's just remarkable that you Nevada, Marin, Alameda County, city and county of San Francisco. Um, you're also really active nationally. You go to a lot of the national conferences. You're active professionally. You're active with researchers too. Uh, what do you think are some of the key differences between how we run elections here from an administrator's perspective in California with respect to what you see in many of the other states?
Well, I mean, it's good to know that my skin is still springy and I
You're
still
you're you're
consider to
so
be young.
you are so young, yeah. For someone so
Well,
accomplished, it's amazing.
thank you. Um, I think that what strikes me about, California in particular is, how much we try to engage with voters and give them a lot of time to learn about what is on the ballot. We print a state voter information guide and a county voter information guide. We send out ballots 29 days before the election. Give everyone sort of robust opportunities to choose the manner in which they would like to vote. And I find that to be not necessarily unique. I mean, I think other states have their processes too, but I think in California we are very, very focused on the voter experience. Yeah, I think you may have heard, at least in the past, this focus on voter-centric election
Mhm,
administration, and I think California really does embrace all of that.
mhm,
I also think that us elections officials, and again, this is probably not unique, but something that, really, sort of gets to the heart of why I do what I do. We communicate all the time, us elections officials at the county level, and, we're communicating with the Secretary of State's office, quite frequently. There's a lot of touch points that, I've, heard elsewhere, there might not be as many touch points, especially with the sort of communication between the locals and the state. But, we are sort of engaged all the time with what each other is doing and extending out offers of help if someone is sort of having a difficult time, or asking, hey, we have the situation here in this county, what are you all doing? And we'll without any shame steal people's ideas, and it is great. And so the level of collaboration is something that I embrace, and I would hope that it's happening in all other states as well.
I'm going to borrow the phrase voter centric in the future, if you don't mind. I will cite you, right? But I To me, that is a very, I mean, I do agree with you about California being in many ways very voter centric, but I also think that this notion of voter centric election administration has evolved over the last couple of decades. Because, when I first got involved in this area, a long time ago, gray hairs to show. Uh, but it wasn't election officials just weren't voter centered. They wanted to stay out of the limelight. I don't think we're quite as collaborative as they are today with each other. Does that make your job as an administrator here in California more complicated, you think, than it might be in other states to be so voter centric?
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't really know. I think that there are, sort of definitely requirements that we have to follow, and we can't, for example, not send out a voter information guide or a
Right,
sample
right,
ballot.
exactly.
Right. There are state mandates that we do have to follow.
Mhm.
And by and large, I would say amongst my cohort, just having met with people and sort of talking to my peers, we really don't want it to be any other way. We want voters to know what's on the ballot. The ballots can get really long. And, I think, as well as anybody, if people aren't informed about what's on the ballot, if they don't really know where to do research, if they don't have basic information, they're really likely to not vote at all. And we really don't go through all of this trouble and do all of this work for nobody to show up. I think I feel physical heartbreak when, people just aren't interested in an election, or, if there's a late arriving ballot. It actually hurts me to see that. And that sentiment is shared with a whole bunch of us. We just want people to vote. We want all of our hard work to, be helpful to the communities that we serve. And, we care very deeply about folks having a voice. And if they choose to participate in the elections process, which I hope they do,
Mhm.
we want it to be easy. We want it to be comprehensive. We want them to tell their friends, hey, this was really easy and all the cool people are voting, so why don't you?
Yeah, and we've got one of those coming up pretty soon. We've got in California, we've got a primary coming up on June 2nd. I get the sense that there does seem to be a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about this primary for lots of reasons. There's a lot of interesting things on the ballot, a lot of candidate races, a lot of things that voters are going to be asked to decide. Um, Now, as we were preparing for this session today, thinking about the primary, um, I understand the two biggest priorities that you have going into the primary are going to be voter education and contingency planning.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
you've already talked a little bit about voter education, some of the things that you're required to do. What are some of the biggest topics that you really think you need to educate voters on today? And again, how's that evolved over the years? I mean, what are you really communicating to voters as we approach this primary?
I mean, well, there's some of the basic stuff like when is voting taking place?
Mhm.
When's the last day to vote? Where can you vote? Who's on the ballot? What measures, are going to be on the ballot? So the basic stuff like that is something that we're always going to communicate. But what I'm really honing in on right now is basic information that voters really, I don't know that they thought to ask until now, but there is this information just sort of dump right now with elections, and it sort of relates to the contingency planning stuff because I myself, even knowing what I know, sometimes I'm not quite sure what to focus on.
Mhm.
I'm not quite sure what it is out there that I need to pay closer attention to, what is just talk
Mhm.
amongst, people in politics. I'm not quite sure what to plan for. And I think that, many voters are sort of going through the same thing. So for example, when I am asked to talk to folks, a lot of people are asking me about the SAFE Act. And,
Hmm.
I think, for sure that there's, elements of that legislation that would be really difficult to implement in California. And at the same time, it does not appear to me that it's going to become law anytime soon. So, what I have said to folks is, look, educate yourselves on everything that is happening because, clearly there's interest and a passion for it. But, if you're looking to me to know how worried to be about it, I can't tell you that. But, what I can tell you is I'm more focused on stuff that's more immediate. And to me, what's more immediate is, whether or not we're going to have a major rule change with the rules on vote by mail in the interim between the June primary and the November election, because, that would be a major change that I think
Hmm.
would cause people to sort of change their routine.
Hmm.
A lot of ballots come to us
Right.
on election day and some after, even with vote by mail. So we would need to be, as loud as we possibly can, given our budget constraints about the rule change, so people don't get disenfranchised. And that's sort of the communications challenge. What do we focus on? And how do we sort of get people to maybe stay a little bit grounded.
Hmm.
Because yeah, a lot of this is tied into how people feel about the current administration. And, I'm a nonpartisan elections official. I don't engage with folks that way, but I can say, here's what the law says.
Hmm.
I can't promise you what will or won't happen, but we follow the law. And so let's talk about some of those basics.
Hmm. So yeah, there again, there are lots of required. You're required by law to do a lot of things in terms of voter education. Sending mail in particular, posting materials on your website, things like that.
Mhm.
Beyond that, though, what do you think are really effective modes of communication? Social media, speaking to people. I mean, what do you think is the most effective way, especially now in Marin County, to educate voters and communicate them outside of what you have to do by law?
Right. I mean, I think that we have lots of modes of communication, the great majority of which I'm not sure what kind of attention that people are putting on it. I mean, we've got all kinds of stuff in the voter information guide and on our website, and we blast things out through social media, but a lot of information is sort of provided in silos. I have no idea if the people who need to see certain things from our office are actually getting it.
Mhm.
I certainly, sort of have opportunities to write op-eds for the
Mhm.
local paper, and to do webinars like this.
Right.
But, I think the thing that seems to be the most compelling, just from my perspective, is talking to people in person.
Mhm.
Remember when we talked to people in person and didn't
Yeah.
just like text them or, do all the, sort of Brady
Yeah.
Bunch Square stuff. I actually enjoy going out into the community, going to folks' events and, sort of answering their questions so they, one can see that the elections process is run by people.
Mhm.
I know we like to, call government employees bureaucrats, and I guess technically that's right, but we're also human beings with like families and feelings. I think that's always helpful for folks to know, right? And I think that showing that you're, willing as the one of the county leaders to come to an event,
Right.
answer people's questions, take time, look them in the eye. That to me, I think is, I mean, it's important to me, but I think, it's sort of a compelling opportunity. I wish I had time to talk to more people. We just have to rely on all of our communication channels,
Mhm.
try to put stuff in front of folks and, encourage, our friends in the academic and advocacy communities to also spread the word to their networks.
Well, and to be honest, I think that's all very effective because, while there's a lot of chatter, kind of in the election space right now about there being a trust in voter confidence, or excuse me, a crisis of voter confidence. I'm not entirely sure the evidence supports that, but what we typically see though is that trust is high when it comes to the local officials, the local process, how elections are run for me, right, as a voter in my county or my municipality. I think that's partly because of all these touches that you have, right?
Mhm.
These opportunities that you have. People actually they put a name to their elections, they put a face to their elections. I really I can't tell you how much of a return from your investment of your time in doing these kind of events really matters for voter confidence, but I suspect that there's a pretty strong effect there.
Think so. I mean, I think there's, practicality about it. I
Yeah,
think I'm easier to reach than Dr. Weber. No offense against our
exactly.
Secretary of State, Shirley Weber, but she's got a lot of
Hmm.
responsibilities and isn't always in Marin County, but I am, and everyone knows where the
Right.
Civic Center is, and they can come here, ask questions, get answers. So there's that, but there's also the actual voter experience, and I
Mhm.
think the research does show that that does matter
Mhm.
too.
Yep.
If you have a problem with your ballot, you're probably less likely to feel confident compared to somebody
Mhm.
who had an easy time.
Yep. And again, I think people are smart enough to know who to credit or who to blame, right? If they
Yeah,
have a bad experience. And generally, as you know, the data indicates that most people have positive voting experiences, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think so. I think so. It's something that I wish that would be widely reported.
Well, we try.
I
People,
know you try.
we
I
all
just
try,
wish that,
right?
maybe the editorial board for the New York Times would say
Well,
something like
I would
that.
love it if there would just be a fact check every time someone says crisis of voter confidence, right? Let's have a fact check on that because I'd really like to see the data on that. And there are concerns out there. Obviously, people are concerned about the integrity of the elections and democracy, and they should be, right? We should all be concerned about that. But I don't see any evidence for an actual crisis of voter confidence today.
Yeah, I don't know what that means. I'll leave it to you
I
to.
don't know either. So we'll both have to figure it out. But so the next thing I did want to talk about though was the other priority, which is contingency planning. This is a really interesting area for me, just because we've been thinking a lot about contingency planning and how we can help. But other than the obvious answer, preparing for every contingency, right? What are maybe the two or three really big contingencies that you're planning for specifically right now for the primary, and then we can maybe talk also about the transition from the primary to the general, because you've already alluded to one.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right that we try to plan for all known contingencies. Obviously everything is a bit much. But there's certain things that, they were always going to be in the back of, our mind, not just in elections, but countywide. For example, you're absolutely right that we are located in the San Francisco Bay Area. That means that there might be an earthquake.
Right.
What if that happens on election day and some of our vote centers are not available?
Mhm.
Or a power outage, what if, a big part of the grid goes out, and what does that mean in terms of, our ability to report, voter safety, election worker safety, and, how, we would go about redirecting people. There's also these newer issues that are cropping up that have been widely discussed as a what if. And
Mhm.
this is where I sort of get like, okay, well, which of these what ifs are, sort of rising to the top? Which ones, importantly, would I have to coordinate with other agencies in order to figure out what we would do? Um, and one of them that's been talked about is federal immigration at a voting location. I think that's a tough one. And
Mhm.
also, what if this maybe the enforcement is not happening at the voting location, but what if it's happening someplace else? and
Mhm.
there's, sort of protests and, sort of other activities that
Mhm.
sort of bleed into, the voting process. And, so what I have done is work pretty closely with our county's Office of Emergency Management to, try to suss out, okay, well, in terms of problem identification, is this, the full scope of what we're worried about? And, we have planned a tabletop exercise to sort of work that out with members of my team, plus, local law enforcement, the emergency management office, and others to, sort of get at, okay, well, how are we going to communicate with each other? How are we going to, sort of either, sort of defer to people or, sort of make sure that, we're sort of informing all of the necessary stakeholders.
Mhm.
It can get quite complicated, and I would never want to assume what law enforcement is going to do in either of the situations that I identified. So it'll be educational for me and my staff, and similarly the police, in case you don't know, they don't really deal with the penal provisions of the elections code that much. I don't think they, really think about it that much because, I mean, frankly, there's not really a lot of problems that happen
Right.
in elections. So I think it's potentially informative to them to know certain things like, no, the voting equipment is not connected to the internet.
Mhm.
And I mean, it gets back to, sort of my point about basic information that people who don't think about this stuff really don't know. And when they learn it, they go, oh,
Mhm.
okay, I never realized that. That changes my whole way of thinking. It'll be great.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't be surprised if, we talk after this election cycle. I would not be surprised if we sort of talk about how smooth the election went.
Well, that's generally the case, right? We generally talk a lot about, I did a lot of these with other election officials and yourself in 2024. We talked a lot about contingencies and things you're worried about, and then after the election, we generally are breathing a big sigh of relief because things actually generally go pretty well, right?
Yeah, yeah,
We're all
absolutely.
mobilized if something's not going to go well, but just, generally it goes well.
Right. And I think it goes well because we take the time to do the planning.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the contingency though that you brought up earlier, which is the possibility that, like in July, we may learn, right, that the rules about receiving, late arriving absentee ballots, votes by mail, may change in California. How do you approach planning for a contingency like that right now, especially because that would happen probably right after the primary, and you got a lot of other things to worry about right now, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And what I would hope is that, my colleagues in the Secretary of State's office could come together on, sort of messaging. I'm not sure if that's going to happen or not. But, I think the most important thing in that case is going to be information, how we distribute that information and, how sort of often we're able to engage publicly on what the rules are, because I mean that is very concerning. And
Mhm.
you've probably seen the data with, the trend of ballot returns
Right.
in this state. Folks are, kind of still deciding. I'll just be generous about that. They're still deciding when they get their ballot, how they're going to vote. They're doing their research, and then the either the Monday before or the
Mhm.
day of, they're actually casting a ballot. In Marin County, with all the returns that we get for every election, I would say 90% or more are putting their ballot in an envelope and returning it in some way.
Mhm.
In the November 2025 special, about 60% of those ballots were by mail, and the rest of those vote by mails were returned in the drop box.
Mhm.
So I would hope that if folks still go with their same pattern of, sort of waiting until election day to cast their ballot, that they would use the drop box
Right.
and, not put the ballot into the mail stream. And, again, I I rely on the state and our sort of
Mm.
partners to help communicate that message. I wish that I had the kind of budget and the sort of communications experience to have all of these messages come from our office. There's
Mhm.
just too many media silos. It's difficult to keep up
Mhm.
with everything that's going on. And yeah, I am concerned that there will be thousands of people
Mhm.
that yeah, we just can't count their ballots. So yeah, the communications contingency is going to be very, very important. Um, there's other options that we could probably exercise that, I don't know if we can still do it, but, one idea that actually it was a thing that I think used to happen more commonly in elections offices is that you would do something called ballot trapping.
Mhm.
And you would actually go to the post office and say, okay, all of these ballots that you may get today, keep them. Don't put them in the mail stream. Don't send them to the nearest
Mhm.
distribution center. Keep them. We'll take them. And, people will be able to get their ballots counted. But, I think there's been quite a few changes at the post office,
Right.
so not quite sure if that's still available to us, but we do also have regular meetings with the
Mhm.
USPS. So I believe that we'll sort of work out the details and a solution, but the key thing is that voters, please, if at all possible, please do not wait until election day. We have given you 29 days to have you make a decision. If you have any questions for us, please do ask them. We just want you to vote.
Mhm. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see because it will be I think it's going to be a communications issue. It's all because you're going to have to reorient behavior, right? And I think that as
And
we
it's very
talk,
hard to change voter
very,
behavior.
very hard to change voting behavior. But now we're talking about vote by mail, and you've had a huge amount of experience with voting by mail in California. What are some of the misconceptions that you think people have, especially outside of California or outside of, largely vote by mail states, about the vote by mail process?
Oh, geez. I think that, one of the things that I've heard from folks well, and let me just step back a second. So, recently I was able to do a tour of our nearest processing facility. It's in San Francisco.
Hmm.
And it's quite a sight to behold. You're not allowed to take pictures or anything in this place. The security is pretty tight in there, but you walk in and you see like all of these huge machines that just process massive amounts of sort of flat pieces and packages and postcards and, sort of all the things. And it's all this, sort of well orchestrated, very machine heavy dance of all the things that, sort of eventually arrive to you. And was looking at all of the stuff and going, I wish that people who tell me that the postal workers are like looking through the drill hole of the envelope and seeing how you voted, or looking to see whether they like your vote or not, and they're tossing the ones that they don't like. It's like, no, the machinery, you're not going to put your hands in it. No one's got no flashlights looking through to see what the contents are at the ballot. I mean, it like nothing of what I saw would indicate that there's even any opportunity to do
Right.
anything like that. No one's throwing away anything. Everyone is there to just move things from point A to point B. And that basically amounts to putting the thing on a conveyor belt
Hmm.
and it going to the next stage of the process where they, figure out where a piece of mail has to go.
Hmm.
I really wish that folks could see what a huge, sort of machine-driven process that is, where, I mean, yeah, no one's looking at how you voted or even cares. I think, also, I would say that, the same thing happens in our office. We don't look to see who, whether the voter is someone we might agree or disagree with. We're not like, setting, sort of like provisional ballots aside unless the contest is close. We are counting everything that lawfully can be counted. The other thing that I would mention is, that it takes quite a while to process a vote by mail ballot. And, I think what folks have been saying that I've heard in other states is, that, maybe we're slow rolling it, that, we're taking a long time because we can, because the certification date is a month out. And, I can emphatically say that not only is that not true, but it's, a little insulting. We have been working really hard without a day off, in a Voters' Choice Act county, that will start, sort of at E-10. And, the expectation that we're going to have like, more staff, like, I mean, where are these people? And more money to pay them, or more space to house them, or we're going to be working 24-hour shifts. I mean, I'm sorry, but there are labor laws and my people deserve a break, just like everyone deserves a day off.
Hmm.
Just to get the results like a day or two faster. I mean, my goodness, y'all, we're going, by and large, most of us are going as fast as we can, and, respecting that people want to go home and maybe have dinner with their families.
Hmm.
Again, this is a community affair. We are not robots. I certainly do not want to work for 3 weeks straight without one day off because someone's anxious about who's going to win what contest. I
Hmm.
mean, I'm sympathetic, especially when the election result is close.
Hmm.
And at the same time, I mean, we get so much thrown at us, all the unfunded mandates and, all of the accusations that, maybe, there's something nefarious going on. I mean, it's just not true. And the best way to learn is to come in and
Hmm.
observe.
Yep.
Observation is our tool to show people that we are, we're doing the long division. We're showing the work. And if you still don't think we're working hard enough, well, then, I guess we can't turn everyone around. But
And again, talking about California, this is one of the things about the California process that I still find remarkable and I'm thankful for, which is that we have this incredibly transparent process where I, my students, anybody can go and observe the process, right? There are rules, right? Yeah, of course, but you can go and see it. Now, that is just not true in many states. In fact, many of the people who want to complain about our process in California come from states where they don't have those opportunities. And I'm always like, why don't you just come to California and see how it works, right? Rather
yeah,
than
and we're waiting for people.
exactly. Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing about it. When I go do this kind of observation, it's usually more down in Southern California, I'm often shocked by how few people are there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all of our, sort of more critical enthusiasts who, want to talk to me about, basically things that are,
Mhm.
sort of prescribed by law.
Right.
I tell them, the best thing that you can do is come in and observe, ask questions. Under the Voter Bill of Rights in California, you have the right to ask questions about elections process and get answers.
Right.
We might not be able to give them to you right then and there, but we do need to follow up because, that right exists. So I say, come in, see what's
Mhm.
happening. I've even, taken the time with observers on occasion to tell them, hey, look, come closer and look at what this is.
Mhm.
And, let me explain it to you. And I think that they, appreciate it.
Mhm.
And by and large, most people who come for the first time because, they have these questions and they want answers, they are not really likely to come back, I think, because they're sort of surprised that we did, in fact, answer the questions and they could see it for themselves. In, some of our frequent flyers, I think a lot of them also understand that, we're following a process. We've been open about what that
Mhm.
process is. And, if you want to come every day and make sure we're still following the rules, sure.
Mhm.
Come on
Watch.
down.
Come and see. Come and
Yeah,
see.
I know. I know. We like company.
Yeah, I know. That's the other thing. When I show up, here in Orange County, LA County, Southern California, they're so excited, right? They love to see people. It's like, yeah, they have guests. People show interest in what they're doing. It's just a human reaction, right?
Yeah,
People
yeah. And
like
I'm
that.
like,
So,
yeah, join the party, spread the
join the
word.
party. So we have a question that came in, and I wanted to. This is an interesting question. Just wanted to ask you about this, and I'll read it. Natalie, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on voters bringing their vote by mail ballots to a voting location and casting it as an in-person ballot. In Placer County and elsewhere, apparently this is called sign, scan, and go.
Uh-huh.
Is that a potential approach that you might think of in Marin County, and statewide?
Yeah, we do allow it. It's actually, sort of available in any county. And, I think that it makes sense. So, basically we send you an official ballot in the mail. There's really no reason, particularly in a Voters Choice Act county, because we
Mhm.
have the voter roll there.
Right.
We can see whether we've accepted a ballot from you or not.
Mhm.
The key thing is to, make sure that the voter checks in with us.
Mhm.
They can't just, come in, go right to the ballot box and then, sort of drop that in. That's not how that works. We do still need to record the voter participation history. And so for counties that, have the election worker looking in real time at the voter participation history, then
Mhm.
yeah, and I mean that's true here in Marin too. And we do have several voters who just bring in their ballot and they're like, "Can I use this one?" It's like,
Mhm.
"Yeah, sure. Let's just make sure you get checked in, proceed to the ballot box, and you voted and get your sticker and tell
Mhm.
everyone you had a nice time."
No, it's great. It's a great idea, and I'm glad that folks have been thinking about that. I just haven't seen it in Southern California, but maybe we'll see more of that, in the next couple of cycles. So we're getting. I mean, I've taken up a huge amount of your time. One final question for you,
Sure.
which is we've talked a lot about this over the years because I know you have a research background, a policy background, an administrative background. What is it that we as researchers, like especially in this election cycle, can do to help you? I mean, are there specific projects that we can take on? Is it more just being, supportive when we talk to reporters and things like what can the research community do to help you and help your colleagues here in California?
I mean, it'd be great if I saw researchers come to the elections office more often.
Okay.
Just getting back to the, observation thing, I think it's great that you actually go and, perhaps bring some of your students. I think doing something like that would be sort of really spectacular if, you had researchers who just came in. I think the tendency is to just want to get the data and do the analysis. But, what I would say to those folks is, elections are a, sort of people-driven endeavor that, rests on levels of trust. And,
Hmm.
this is something that I tell our election workers all the time. It's like, look, we trust that you will come back to serve. We trust that there will be people out there who volunteer their properties to host in-person voting. We sort of trust that our, processes are are lawful, and that is the basis for the legitimacy of any election. And so when that trust falters, you kind of see the consequence of it. The fallout from the 2020 election was pretty devastating to me, because you saw where that tipping point happened, and it was driven by a lot of information that is not correct. And I don't think that it's a great idea to rely only on the things that you see on the internet for your primary source. Come to our office, our physical office, and I mean that is your primary source, especially nowadays. I mean, who knows what's real on the internet anymore? There's so much AI and stuff that I certainly can't control. I haven't seen a lot of it. I don't know that I want to see much of it, but I think people are just getting bombarded with sometimes what did the young people call it now? AI slop.
Yep.
And other stuff that might not be sort of artificial, but it's false anyway. Who in their right mind, who's got a busy life, who doesn't think about this stuff all the time, can sift through all of that?
Mhm.
I mean, I think the research community could visit us and sort of talk to us. I realize that I am sort of unique in my cohort, because I've got all of this cross-pollination going on. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn from each other, especially if there's something you want to research. We
Mhm.
can tell you whether or not we have those data to begin with.
Right. Exactly. Okay.
And
Well,
help guide you a little bit.
sounds
So
like an invitation for a road trip. So
yeah, there you
I'll
go.
take you up on that one. And the Bay Area is nice because, assuming, traffic aside, opportunity to visit a number of election offices. I mean, when I was younger and we had election day voting here in Southern California, on election day, I'd go to LA, I'd go to Orange County, and sometimes I'd even go to Riverside and San Bernardino because, they're contiguous sufficiently so you could actually go and see things in all counties.
Oh
Might,
yeah,
might try that
yeah.
up in the Bay Area.
Hey, I mean, it's kind of compact. You don't have to like go you drive as far to get
Yeah,
to some of
exactly.
our offices.
Yeah.
Yeah, our door's open, and I will say that the Marin County Civic Center is kind of nice.
Okay, well, there you go. I'm gonna have to visit. Now, I'm gonna have to let you go. So, is there anything you wanted to add before we finish?
Oh, no, just thank you for spending time with me and inviting me to the office hours. And yeah, I hope that you are doing well. Whoever's out there online, I hope y'all are doing well and staying calm and grounded. I do a lot of yoga, so I don't have many worries.
Great tip. Yoga is a great thing, especially in today's world. But great seeing you. Thank you for being here with me here today. Really, really appreciate it and love seeing you again.
Thank you. Good to see you too.
All right, you take care.
Bye.